192nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, famine and conflict-induced global food insecurity. The agenda is adopted. First, I wish to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence here today underscores the importance of the subject matter that is under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Belarus, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Chile, Cuba, Denmark, Egypt, Estonia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Germany, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Jordan, Kenya, Latvia, Lebanon, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Mexico, Morocco, Myanmar, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Nigeria, Oman, Pakistan, Panama, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Romania, Saudi Arabia, Sierra Leone, Singapore, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, Ukraine, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Vietnam, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Reena Ghelani, United Nations Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator. Mr. David Miliband, President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Rescue Committee. And Ms. Naveen Salem, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of ADISIA. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in the meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Thibaut Kameli, Chargé d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and His Excellency, Mr. Paul Beresford-Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the observer state of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in this meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2023/560, a letter dated 26 July 2023 from the Permanent Representative of the United States of America to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2023/4. I now give the floor to Ms. Reena Ghelani. Ms. Ghelani, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this briefing today. Mr. President, this Council is more than aware of the multiple challenges and threats the world is facing today. But the threat of famine, people starving slowly to death, must be a red line. And yet the number of people suffering from acute food insecurity reached 250 million last year. This is the highest recorded in recent years. Of these people, some 376,000 were facing famine-like conditions in 7 countries. Another 35 million people were on the edge. As in all crisis situations, women and children are the most impacted. This situation has not come as a surprise. It is a man-made crisis that has been swelling for years. We are now at the tipping point. Mr. President, hunger and conflict feed off each other. Conflict and insecurity remain key drivers of hunger and famine. Every one of the 7 countries where people faced famine-like conditions last year were affected by armed conflict or extreme levels of violence. 5 of those 7 countries, Afghanistan, Haiti, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, are regularly on this Council's agenda. Armed conflict destroys food systems, shatters livelihoods, and drives people from their homes, leaving many extremely vulnerable and hungry. Sometimes these impacts are byproducts of war, but all too often they are inflicted deliberately and unlawfully, with hunger utilised as a tactic of war. Conflict does not spare those who are providing assistance to stave off famine. Last year, dozens of humanitarian workers were killed, and many more were kidnapped or injured in situations of conflict. Humanitarian facilities and supplies also often come under attack, are looted, or used for military purposes. The difficulties the United Nations, NGOs, and their partners are facing in Sudan is a stark reminder, and our deepest condolences to the families of the 11 humanitarian workers killed in Sudan in recent weeks. Food insecurity itself also fuels instability. For example, recent research highlighted by the World Food Programme has shown how food insecurity, when coupled with pre-existing grievances, desperation too often fueled by poverty and inequality, and governance issues cause people to choose violence over peace. It is the straw that breaks the camel's back, often resulting in conflict. Mr. President, Excellencies, conflict-induced hunger is compounded by a toxic mix of climate change and economic shocks. Climate change is increasingly becoming a threat multiplier, as the stress on water and other natural resources leads to increased competition and displacement, conflicts and hunger spread. Of the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate-related risks, 7 are affected by conflict, 6 host a UN peacekeeping or special political mission, and 4 have more than 1 million people one step away from famine. At the same time, insecurity in conflict-affected countries hinders climate adaptation efforts. This leaves already vulnerable communities even poorer, hungrier, and less resilient. Mr. President and Excellencies, the challenge may appear overwhelming, but progress has been and is again possible. So what can we do? First and foremost, we must redouble efforts to prevent, reduce, and end conflict in all its forms. There needs to be a renewed commitment to peace through a reinvigorated multilateral system where governments, the United Nations, and regional organisations work hand in hand. Where peace may still take time, 5 things are critical to reduce suffering and prevent famine. 1, ensuring parties to conflicts respect international humanitarian law. This includes protecting objects necessary for survival, such as food stocks, water systems, and other objects necessary for food production and distribution systems. It also includes facilitating unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need and protecting humanitarian staff and assets. States must spare no effort in exerting their influence to ensure parties respect the rules of war. 2, making better use of existing early warning mechanisms, such as Resolution 2417, in a focused and effective manner. Too often we have sounded the warning alarm without effective follow-up and concentrated action. 3, being bold and creative in finding ways to mitigate the impact of war on the most vulnerable. Such solutions are possible. We have seen agreements between parties to the two conflicts and resolutions in this Council agreed to for this end, but they require political courage and compromise. 4, women and girls must be at the centre of our efforts. Crisis and hunger affect them disproportionately, and they also hold the key to lasting solutions. Research has shown that involving local women in peacebuilding increases the probability that violence will end by 24%. And 5, we also need to acknowledge that a halfway, fragmented response to interconnected risks will not cut it. We need adequate humanitarian funding on which the lives of millions depend. And for lasting peace and famine prevention, we must address the climate and economic crisis. The Secretary-General has prioritised the threat of famine and hunger. Among other initiatives, in 2021, he created a high-level task force on famine prevention to lead and organise a cohesive system-wide response. Together with WFP, FAO, IRC, with David, we're in the process of reorientating this forum to provide dedicated support to countries. We really need your support, and we count on it to make this an effective forum. Mr. President, in this role, I have visited communities teetering on the brink of famine. I've sat with mothers in too many nutrition wards, in too many displacement camps, and as their small children fought for their lives, they were too weak to cry, even make a sound. That eerie silence is deafening. It never leaves you. That silence is also a call for action. As Martin Luther King said in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, famine is wholly unnecessary in the modern world. There is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is human will. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Ghelani for her briefing, and I give the floor now to Mr. David Miliband. David.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to you and your team for your leadership on this issue. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true honour to speak today on behalf of the 40,000 International Rescue Committee employees and volunteers working in 40 countries around the world. Our mission is defined by conflict and its consequences, so this debate means a lot to us and to our clients. Every day, our staff live out a simple mantra: focus on the solutions, not the suffering. So my briefing today takes the form of a plea to this Council to follow my colleagues and focus on the solutions, not the suffering. 5 years ago, the Council, and I quote, recognised the need to break the link of armed conflict and food insecurity in Resolution 2417. 5 years later, however, there is more armed conflict, more famine, more malnutrition, and more food insecurity. Food insecurity, the euphemism that is used for hunger and starvation. So today, our call is for action to help the 375,000 people facing famine-like conditions at the end of last year, a number that has only risen, and the 35 million on the brink. Mr. President, we have more than enough analysis. There is consensus that conflict is the primary driver of food insecurity today, exacerbated by the climate crisis. Consensus, too, on the line of causation from conflict to hunger. Planting is disrupted, prices are driven up, combatants block supplies, food storage is targeted, coping capacities are depleted. We also know the countries. Every single assessment has the same list: Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, Haiti. The analysis is not in dispute, but analysis is too often followed by paralysis. So we need new muscle in the international system, not the muscle of debating strategies and plans, but the muscle of taking action. Today, I present to the Council 5 current problems matched by 5 immediate solutions. Problem 1. My colleagues on the panel will rightly draw attention to the impact of last year's funding increases on raising the number of children with acute malnutrition who are being treated. But the year-on-year statistics show that 80% of the world's acutely malnourished children are not getting any treatment at all. I repeat, 80% of acutely malnourished children have been getting no help. The reason is the divided approaches between moderate and severe acute malnutrition, different treatment and diagnosis protocols, different UN agencies, different products, complicated measuring systems ill-suited to conditions of conflict. The solution, however, is staring us in the face: a simplified system in the hands of parents and community health workers who use a simple upper arm circumference tape to diagnose acute malnutrition and administer 1 or 2 doses of ready-to-use therapeutic food per day, depending on whether the case is severe or moderate. Our own impact evaluation shows that this approach is not a pipe dream. We tested it on 27,000 children in Mali. We showed a 92% success rate with the treatment, with a cost saving of 30%, so more children can be reached for the same amount of money. Mr. President, this approach should be made the norm, the default form of provision in humanitarian settings, with delivery and funding to match, and it could be done now. Problem 2, there is proliferation of different global initiatives on famine and food insecurity. The solution is an empowered body to galvanize collective action and drive change. Fortunately, we do now have the high-level task force on preventing famine, chaired by Ms. Ghelani, and given new focus and a new mandate. But frankly, Reena needs support for national famine action plans in the countries most at risk, support from national and local authorities in developing those plans, support for engagement of regional and global financial institutions in funding and financing those plans, support in diplomacy to unlock barriers on the ground to scale up a response, and support in turning delivery plans into action, starting at the September meetings in this city. Problem 3, the United Nations Development Programme reports that the more fragile a context, in other words, the more amount of conflict, the less money is spent on climate adaptation. Yet our clients represent a disproportionate amount of climate risk. They are highly vulnerable and lack investment in resilience. The solution is to give climate finance a humanitarian face, addressing the finance gap and the delivery gap. The finance gap arises because adaptation is underfunded. It's only 8% of all climate finance. And adaptation is geared towards richer countries. So we argue that a set percentage of every adaptation fund should be directed to fragile and conflict states. We also argue that donors need to increase the ratio of grants to concessional funding because fragile and conflict states don't want to take on new loans. For example, trebling the World Bank's international development assistance funds as the G20 panel recommended just 2 weeks ago. However, there is a delivery gap too. The money will not be spent in fragile and conflict states unless this delivery gap is addressed. In conflict situations, that means making it the norm, not the exception, for funding to be directed through civil society and not just through governments. This would be real localization. Problem 4, the rise of impunity in conflict. Combatants attack civilians, deny humanitarian aid, destroy farms and food warehouses, all illegal as well as immoral. The solution is that perpetrators need to be held to account. We do not need new resolutions for this, but we need resolution to uphold the existing ones. The next time this council is presented, for example, with evidence of hunger used as a weapon of war, it must trigger action. Also, all 9 countries at risk of famine this year rank either high, very high, or extreme in levels of humanitarian access constraints. That's another euphemism for stopping humanitarian aid workers reaching people in need. We propose an independent office for the protection of humanitarian access, which would ensure that when combatants deny aid, this information is reported without fear or favour to this council, supporting efforts to drive accountability and diplomacy. Problem 5. I know that NGOs usually start by asking for more money, but I will end with it instead of starting with it. The World Food Programme is cutting its life-saving food assistance programs today, sometimes by as much as half, because it does not have enough money to do its job. The solution to this, Mr. President, is not complicated. Humanitarian response plans in the 9 countries at risk of famine were on average only 58% funded in 2022. Yet if these countries' response plans were funded to the same proportion as Ukraine's last year, there would be another $5 billion in the system to address the most acute needs just in those 9 countries. We need to address the threat of famine by looking through the windshield, not through the rear-view mirror. Once a famine is declared, it's too late for too many. We know from the 2011 famine in Somalia that half the people who died before the famine declaration was made. It's too late for too many to wait for a famine declaration. Phase 3 of the IPC system, the International Phase Classification System, the crisis phase, is triggered when 1 in 5 families are so desperate to find their next meal that they are considering marrying off their children or sending them out to work. But anticipatory action depends on cash being available, and today it is not. I want to end, Mr. President, by quoting the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, whose landmark work on famine 50 years ago starts with these words. Quote, "Starvation is the characteristic of not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there not being enough food to eat." In other words, it's a political problem. 50 years later, however, the world is 4 times richer, but there is more famine, not less. That is not fate, it's choice. And it's a choice that will only be changed by action. We in civil society do not lack ideas for which actions to take. What we need is the will to enable them to happen. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank Mr. Miliband for his briefing. I give the floor now to Ms. Naveen Salem.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to your excellencies. The day I first met a 2-year-old that weighed the same as my newborn daughter, it changed me forever. I have been face to face with a mother and a starving child, and I know we don't have time to spare. I feel the urgency, and I see the fear in her eyes. I have seen children take their last breaths. I have watched their hearts stop beating. When I enter a malnutrition clinic, the first thing I hear is that deafening silence. The children don't have the strength to sit up or cry. All their energy is conserved to keep their organs from shutting down. Their mothers sit anxiously by, wishing for a miracle. We have that miracle. Today, I am representing the private sector as the founder and CEO of Edicia. We make the food that saves lives. This is a ready-to-use therapeutic food called plumpy nut. It is used in the treatment of severe acute malnutrition, and it's used by UNICEF, the World Food Program, and USAID. It is a highly fortified peanut butter that is revolutionary in humanitarian settings because it delivers life-saving nutrition, is easy to distribute in complex humanitarian crises, allows mothers to treat their children at home, and it has the power to rehabilitate 92% of children in just 2 months. Edicia is part of a community of factories around the world. We work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to produce enough of these miracle foods. But every day, the needs grow. All of us have been adding shifts, adding equipment, and yet more is needed. We manufacture here in the United States and have a partner in France, but our other 8 partners are in the global south. Conflicts threaten to close the doors of these incredibly important businesses that are set up in malnutrition hotspots to deliver these life-saving foods using locally grown raw materials. Just a few months ago, when the conflict in Sudan began, I was deeply saddened to see that our partner factory in Khartoum was bombed. Everything was destroyed, including thousands of boxes of plumpy nut who are waiting to be deployed to the children of Sudan. And now, this past week, a coup threatens our partner factory in Niger. In Haiti, violence persists at ever-increasing levels, forcing them to construct new security walls. In Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso, instability and uncertainty are ever present. This ecosystem is a critical part of the supply chain that the UN agencies depend on and children depend on, and they must be protected. The 2 biggest contributing factors to hunger and malnutrition are climate change and conflict. We here today have the easier problem to solve. Even with all the good efforts put into addressing climate change, it still will take many decades. The good news is this is not true for conflict. We control the conflicts. We, right here in this room. Just as we decide to wage war, we can decide to end war. Right now, we have 2 choices: feed all the severely malnourished children in the world or stop the conflicts. Annually, $1.7 billion is needed to feed 17 million severely malnourished children. Until we end these conflicts, We have the responsibility to take action. Just $1.7 billion to save the lives of 17 million children. A mere $100 per child covers the cost of a box of Plumpy Nut, distribution, and access to community health care. But with conflicts increasing, our partners have to make tough choices every day. They are struggling with critical funding shortfalls and are only able to reach 50% of the need. They are faced with the impossible decision of which half of the children can live and which half will be sentenced to death. Every day, they must decide which countries will receive funding and which programs will be cut or halved. 1 year ago, the world took notice of increasing conflict-induced food insecurity, and the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Netherlands, Ireland, and private philanthropies made a historic commitment of $500 million to combat malnutrition. The global momentum proved that we could double the supply of Plumpy Nut available in a matter of months. The number of children's lives saved was doubled as well, with 7.3 million children treated in 2022. The incredible effort should be recognized and celebrated. Doctors describe this intervention as nothing short of a miracle. But I want to stop producing this miracle. I don't want to grow this business, add shifts, or build more warehouses. We should not be waiting until a child is days away from death to treat them with life-saving food. Instead, the long-term goal needs to be a shift towards prevention. Early childhood development depends on healthy food systems, diverse diets, and essential macro and micronutrients required for the body and brain. Early interventions ensure that children will not only survive, but thrive and reach their full potential. I sit here today representing the thousands of community-based healthcare workers and millions of malnourished children who are desperately asking for our help and our partnership. After all, we are responsible for their circumstances. May history look at us sitting here today around this table as those who stood up for humanity, understood the power of our collective leadership here in this room, and said, stop. Just stop these conflicts for the sake of our children. There are not many problems in the world that we cannot solve. Malnutrition is not one of them.
I thank Ms. Salem for her briefing. Indeed, I thank all three of our briefers for their compelling and important contributions to our discussion this morning. Thank you. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Secretary of State of the United States of America. Again, to our briefers, thank you. And thank you for keeping our focus on what's really at stake here, and that is the human element of our discussions. It's easy to get caught up in numbers and statistics and big concepts, but ultimately it comes down to people. It comes down to children. So I thank you for that focus, as well as on practical solutions to the problem before us. So to all three of our briefers, again, you have powerfully illustrated the challenge before us, but even more important, you've given us very good ideas for actually how to address that challenge. Last September, President Biden told the General Assembly, and I quote, "In every country in the world, if parents cannot feed their children, nothing else matters." In some ways, it's as simple and as stark as that. Too many families are experiencing the overwhelming urgency, the consequence of an unprecedented global food crisis, that, as we've heard, has been fueled by climate, by COVID as well, and, as we're discussing today, by conflict. Hunger and conflict are inexorably linked. Scarce resources heighten tensions between communities and nations. Warring parties weaponize food to subjugate local populations. Indeed, conflict is the largest driver of food insecurity, with violence and unrest pushing 117 million people into extreme deprivation last year. In Sudan, the fighting has disrupted the summer planting season and driven up the cost of food. In Myanmar, where 1 in 5 people is severely undernourished, the military regime is making the problem worse to tighten its grip, including blocking aid convoys. Deteriorating conditions prevent the safe return of nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees who fled their homeland and who now live in Bangladesh on rations that are down to about 27 cents per day. In Yemen, some families have reported and resorted to boiling leaves to stay alive. They call it famine food. Unless the world acts, Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Somalia could all experience famine next year. And again, I ask each of us, pause for that for a moment. Think about what that actually means. Imagine just for a minute if this was your child, your son, your daughter. You heard the compelling description of what that actually is all about. And I hope, if nothing else, having that image in our minds, tying it to our own lives and experiences, will be some added motivation for us to act. Since January 2021, the United States has provided more than $17.5 billion to address famine and food insecurity. In 2021 and 2022, we convened this Council to focus on the intersection between hunger and conflict. We chaired last year's Food Security Ministerial, where we joined over 36 countries in issuing a global roadmap, committing to get food to those in need and to build greater resilience for the future. To date, more than 100 countries have signed that pledge and begun to take concrete steps to actually implement it. But as this crisis ramps up, so must our efforts. This Council is charged with maintaining international peace and security. And we simply cannot preserve peace and security without strengthening food security. Each of us has a responsibility to act. This morning, for the first time in 3 years, this Council has unanimously put conflict, hunger and famine, as well as climate change, at the center of its agenda. This is a noteworthy and welcome step. Now, let's harness the momentum to further combat food insecurity and famine around the world, to turn what we're talking about into concrete actions. 5 years ago, as you've heard, this Council adopted Resolution 2417, emphasizing that the intentional starvation of civilians may constitute a war crime. Today, we can build on these efforts. Nearly 90 countries, including the United States, have already signed a new joint communique that we drafted and circulated, committing to end the use of famine, starvation, and food as weapons of war. Hunger must not be weaponized. I urge all member states to join this communique. We also must significantly increase aid to tackle extreme hunger and to avert famine. Last year, governments and private donors made record contributions, providing direct relief, equipping farmers with fertilizer, using satellite imagery to maximize yields. Donations for the World Food Program jumped 48%. The United States alone provided more than $7.2 billion, funding roughly half of the World Food Program's budget. These and other efforts helped the world narrowly avoid famine last year. But this year, as we've heard, the World Food Program estimates that it has to spend $25 billion to deliver relief to 171 million people. To date, countries have funded only $4.5 billion. In other words, 18% of what's required. The cost of that shortfall will be measured in growth stunted and in lives lost. While we welcome smaller countries punching above their weight, the world's largest economies should be the world's largest donors. For member states that consider themselves global leaders, this is your chance to prove it. All of us can dig deeper. But, of course, we know, while it is necessary, it is not sufficient to meet immediate needs. We must also increase agricultural productivity. We've got to invest in adaptation. We have to build greater resilience to future shocks, especially in regions that are affected by conflict. Around the world, farmers confront soaring temperatures, eroding soil, disappearing groundwater. That reduces yields. It makes crops less nutritious. By 2050, climate change could cut output by as much as 30%, even as global food demand increases by over 50%. So we have a planet that's heading in the coming decades to a population of as much as 10 billion people, with demand going up in accordance, and yet supply is actually declining, not increasing. So as challenging, as urgent as the situation is now, we can also see what's coming if we don't take the necessary steps to address it. Mitigating climate impacts is central to the United States Feed the Future initiative, a public-private partnership to strengthen food systems, to expand social safety nets, to enhance nutrition in 40 countries around the world. We've devoted over $1 billion every year to this effort. Last year, we expanded the program to 8 more target countries in Africa. To build on this work, we've now launched what we call Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils in February, alongside the African Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The shorthand, VAX, through this program, we're identifying the most nutritious indigenous African crops, assessing how climate change will likely affect them, and investing in breeding the most climate resilient and most resilient varieties, as well as improving the soil that they'll grow in. This focus on the quality of the seeds and the quality of the soil can have a powerful impact on sustainable agricultural productivity throughout Africa. Today, I'm also announcing $362 million more to tackle the drivers of food insecurity and to enhance resilience in Haiti and 11 African countries, like getting nutritious food to pregnant women and helping farmers grow hardier and more diverse crops. The United States will continue to do our part, but this is, by definition, a global challenge. It demands global resources. And we'll be looking to governments, to companies, to philanthropies, to help us continue to improve nutrition and invest in sustainable and resilient food systems. Finally, we must address Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the resulting assault on the global food system. This past year, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey, delivered over 32 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs to the world. Wheat exports alone were the equivalent of 18 billion loaves of bread. 18 billion loaves of bread. Keep in mind, this initiative never should have been necessary in the first place. It only was necessary because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its blockade of Ukrainian ports. But the initiative produced concrete, demonstrable, powerful results in making sure that these food products could continue to get to world markets, going to those who needed it. And let's be very clear about who benefited from this initiative. Over half the food products exported through this effort and 2/3 of the wheat went to developing countries. These shipments helped to lower global food prices for everyone by roughly a quarter since Russia's full-scale invasion. Since Russia pulled out of the arrangement on July 17th, ignoring the world's appeals, grain prices have risen by more than 8% around the world. Kenya's foreign ministry called Russia's move, and I quote, a stab in the back. The Kremlin claims that it tore up the deal because international sanctions or restricting its agricultural exports. In reality, sanctions explicitly exclude food and fertilizer. In fact, at the time it abandoned the initiative, Russia was exporting more grain at higher prices than ever before. And what has Russia's response been to the world's distress and outrage? Bombing Ukrainian granaries, mining port entrances, threatening to attack any vessel in the Black Sea, no matter its flag, no matter its cargo. These actions are consistent with Russia's decision last month to block the reauthorization of critical cross-border humanitarian assistance to Syria, a country where, after February's devastating earthquake, 12 million people don't have enough to eat. The United States is prepared to renew efforts to mandate this vital lifeline if the United Nations and Syria cannot find a way forward. We also very much appreciate Turkey and others working to reinstate the grain deal. Every member of this Council, every member of the United Nations should tell Moscow, enough. Enough using the Black Sea as blackmail. Enough treating the world's most vulnerable people as leverage. Enough of this unjustified, unconscionable war. Strengthening food security is essential to realizing the vision of the United Nations Charter, to save generations from the scourge of war and reaffirm the dignity and worth of every single human being. That hope is embodied in one of the statues outside this building of a figure fulfilling the biblical directive to beat swords into plowshares. These words of Scripture are not yet in reach, but we can at least commit not to use our swords to destroy others' plows. We can deliver life-saving aid to those in urgent need. We can ensure that people around the globe are fed now and for years to come. If we do that, if we build a healthier, more stable, more peaceful world for all, we will have at least begun to live up to the responsibility entrusted to us, entrusted to this Council, entrusted to this institution. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Dora bint Mohammed Al-Kibi, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for convening this important meeting today, and to our briefers for bringing their valuable perspectives to our discussion. We align ourselves with the statement made by Oman on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council. More than 700 million people are going hungry around the world, while a third of the world's population, almost 2.5 billion people, had restricted access to food last year. As we have heard from our briefers, there is no single reason for global food insecurity. Though the reasons for it are complex, the human cost is plain to see. 45 million children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. Millions of people are driven to undertake dangerous, irregular migration journeys. There is increased sexual and gender-based violence. We know that food insecurity contributes to conflict and instability, while the reverse is also true. As intricately linked as they are within the Council and globally, we cannot afford not to act. Today, there are 3 points I wish to make to this effect. First, food insecurity is preventable. Preventing food insecurity and famine is a political choice. Bringing food insecurity to an end is a collective endeavor. No one should experience famine. In conflict, international humanitarian law is clear. Parties to armed conflict must take constant care to spare the objects necessary to produce food and drinking water, and they must never target civilian objects. There is not only a moral but a legal duty to uphold these norms, and we call upon all parties to conflict to strictly adhere to their responsibilities. It is also important that those in a position to support and facilitate life-saving humanitarian efforts do so. For its part, the UAE has contributed more than $1.4 billion in assistance over the past 5 years to address food insecurity. Conflicts, such as in Ukraine, can contribute to global food insecurity. Its knock-on effects in world markets mean that those living far beyond any battlefield often struggle to feed their families, especially in the Middle East and parts of Africa, where countries rely heavily on grain imports. In these instances, we must support national strategies and develop innovative approaches and partnerships that meet the scale of the challenge. Second, ensuring global food security requires all hands on deck. We must deepen international partnerships and make the most of multilateral fora at both the international and regional levels. We saw the potential of multilateral efforts to reduce food insecurity through the establishment of Black Sea Grain Initiative. The rise in wheat prices since the agreement came to an end and led and is telling of a global importance of such initiative. A spirit of ambition and global collaboration is also needed to tackle a growing driver of food insecurity, climate change. July was the hottest month on record. As such, we must see unity of purpose at the highest levels to reverse this disturbing trend by taking tangible measures to prevent the rise of temperatures above 1.5 degrees and ensuring climate adaptation and mitigation measures are firmly in place, particularly in fragile areas. All hands on deck truly means all hands and all voices. Those disproportionately affected by food insecurity and climate change, in particular women and youth, must be front and center when designing responses. Recognizing the disparity is not enough. We must encourage their full, equal, and meaningful participation. Third, and finally, we need novel approaches to this challenge. We commend the dedicated efforts of governments, international, regional organizations, private sectors, actors, and humanitarian groups, and their significant achievements in this field. Yet, food insecurity continues to rise. If we limit ourselves to the same approaches, we will not turn this tide. So it's time to expand our approaches. Public-private partnerships are vital to tackling this huge challenge. The UAE is actively engaged in public-private partnerships, such as the Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiative's annual 1 billion meal campaign. And in 2021, the UAE and the United States launched the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate to catalyze innovation in climate-smart agriculture. It now works with over 50 government partners, the private sector and civil society, and has raised more than $13 billion to accelerate transformational change. Mr. President, the world cannot maintain peace and security without one of the most basic needs for humanity. The trend we are witnessing is a testament to the need to redouble our efforts. It is my hope that we seize the opportunity of this meeting to take greater concerted action globally to overcome this challenge. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Al-Kaibi for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kenji Yamada, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, Japan welcomes the issuance of the PRST and commends all the tireless work of you and your U.S. team, as well as the constructive effort made by each fellow member state. It is critical that the Council speak in one voice on its commitment to address conflict-induced food insecurity. Mr. President and colleagues, Japan is seriously concerned that a huge number of people are facing famine and other food insecurity caused by conflict and climate change. Food is a basic human need. Thus, it should not be weaponized at any time. Every day, we hear voices of food insecurity caused by man-made conflict. Japan deeply regrets Russia's decision to unilaterally terminate its participation in Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had allowed grain exports from Ukraine and contributed to global food security. Russia has wasted tremendous amounts of grain by attacking grain storage and loading terminals in Odessa and along the Danube. Meanwhile, Russia announced that it will replace Ukraine in supplying grains to African countries. We should not accept Russia's attempt to weaponize food to destroy grains in Ukraine while increasing its own exports. Japan strongly urges Russia to return to the international framework associated with the UN to resume grain exports from Ukraine in order to relieve food insecurity in the world. Japan also continued to support EU-led solidarity lanes, which works to ensure Ukraine can export grains. Mr. President and colleagues, the UN and this Council should play their roles in combating food security issues while exerting the influence and solidarity. Addressing famine and conflict-induced food insecurity requires not only short-term efforts such as emergency food assistance, but also medium and long-term actions based on the concept of human security, such as strengthening the resilience of food systems. Efforts to prevent conflicts, which are root cause of food insecurity, is also important. In this context, Japan believes that it would be beneficial to reduce future humanitarian needs by addressing a comprehensive way through humanitarian development peace nexus approach. In conflict, it is crucial to protect vulnerable people such as women and children. In order to realize the provision of life-saving assistance for those vulnerable people, parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. Mr. President and colleagues, food security and humanitarian assistance have been top priority for Japan. We have a long history of providing various assistance and international cooperation, including humanitarian aid necessary for those suffering from famine and conflict-induced food insecurity. Japan has also spoken out about the necessity of humanitarian passage on Black Sea to ship grains from Ukraine just after Russia's aggression. Japan is proud to have issued the Hiroshima Statement for Resilient Global Food Security in May, together with countries representing various regions around the world. It can be a comprehensive guideline for responding to the immediate food security crisis and for establishing resilient agriculture and food system in the medium and long term. Before closing, allow me to touch upon the issue of famine and food insecurity in East Asia and beyond. In North Korea, it is reported that many people are suffering from severe hunger. On the other hand, North Korea is spending vast resources on unlawful nuclear and missile development by diverting critical needed resources away from its people at tremendous cost. Violating multiple UN Security Council resolutions, North Korea has been repeatedly launching ballistic missiles and threatening peace and stability in East Asia, even now. Mr. President and colleagues, it is extremely regrettable that the Security Council has not been able to take tangible actions on this matter. The Council must overcome its prolonged silence and take meaningful steps with a united voice. We sincerely ask for everyone understanding and support. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Yamada for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Meggie Fino, Deputy Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the United States Presidency for convening this timely debate and welcome you, Secretary Blinken, in the chair. We're grateful to the United States for its coherence and continued action in keeping the focus on this issue of paramount importance for all of us, especially for those anywhere who continue to struggle to make ends meet. In this respect, we welcome the PRST proposed by the U.S. and adopted this morning as a timely reminder of the collective duty to put everything in place to ensure proper responses to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including malnutrition and famine. I also thank all three briefers for their insightful presentations and for presenting before us the most realistic needs required worldwide today. Food insecurity is a pressing global challenge, and today, more than ever, a range of colliding factors such as conflicts, climate change, underdevelopment, and macroeconomic shocks are threatening global food security worldwide. The number of people facing acute food insecurity has increased from 193 million in 2021 to 258 million in 2022. More than 250 million people faced acute hunger in 58 countries and territories last year. In 19 countries and territories, roughly 117 million people suffer from high levels of acute food insecurity due to conflict and insecurity. This has put a heavy toll on humanitarian interventions and food assistance efforts to meet the growing needs. Further, acute hunger, one step away from famine, is increasingly alarming and constitutes a threat not only to the communities and the populations concerned, but also to peace and security in many regions of the world. This is what is happening nowadays in Afghanistan, Haiti, the Sahel region, South Sudan, Sudan, Yemen, where populations face starvation in absence of urgent humanitarian intervention. This is what is happening in Syria. The Russian veto on the cross-border authorization of Bab al-Hawa, Syria, has endangered the life-saving aid and food security for over 4 million people in northwest Syria, leaving them to the mercy of a ruthless regime notoriously known for its brutality. The Russian withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative confirms a policy of weaponization of food and the use of famine as a bargaining chip to achieve political gains. But Russia did not stop there. With its daily bombardments of seaports targeting grain export facilities, a civilian infrastructure, Russia is committing crimes and is playing with the anxiety of millions, unsure to have food in the coming days and weeks. Moscow's promises to several African countries for modest amounts of free grain supplies, ridiculous compared to the actual needs, are part of its efforts to capitalize on the collapse of the BSGI and gain support in the African continent. But beware, this kind of humanitarian charity will come with a bitter price tag. Without urgent action, more and more people in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond will slip into hunger. Mr. President, the biggest challenge in every conflict is protecting civilians. It is at the same time a collective, solemn commitment. Resolution 2417 represents a breakthrough moment since, for the first time, the Security Council acknowledged the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity and the threat of famine. Using starvation as a weapon, as a tactic of warfare, is wrong and criminal. It is prohibited by international humanitarian law, and we must never tolerate any unlawful denial of humanitarian access and depriving civilians of what is indispensable to their survival. We must never tolerate impunity for violations of international humanitarian law, targeting civilian infrastructure and food-related services. Albania commends the efforts and actions of member states, the UN, its implementing partners, civil society, and the private sector in addressing immediate humanitarian needs, food security, and resilience for populations in need. But the best and the most effective way of preventing famine is to prevent conflict, to stop wars, to tackle the root causes of insecurity at early stages, and invest in peace and development in order to secure sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems in line with the objectives of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by saying that the world has enough food and no one needs to go hungry. Yet, If we really want to ensure food security, we should act to prevent and stop conflicts by choosing peace and development, by engaging into inclusive peace processes, leading to sustainable political solutions, by building resilience, by working together in favor of life with rights and dignity. This is done by saying no, strongly and resolutely, to wars and conflicts and their devastating consequences. This requires vision, leadership, political will, and decisive action. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Fino for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État. Permettez-moi d'abord de féliciter le Royaume-Uni pour sa présidence du Conseil en juillet et je souhaite à vous, Monsieur le Président, ainsi qu'à votre équipe, plein de succès pour la tenue des travaux de ce mois. Vous pouvez compter sur le soutien de la Suisse. Je vous remercie aussi pour l'organisation de ce débat qui tombe à point nommé, ainsi que les intervenantes et l'intervenant pour leur contribution. Nous saluons également la présence des représentants de haut niveau. La guerre engendre la faim et la faim engendre la guerre. La crise alimentaire mondiale est sans précédent et déstabilise des pays et des régions, comme l'a démontré aussi le débat ouvert sur la protection des civils en mai dernier sous présidence suisse. Le phénomène continue de s'aggraver en Somalie, au Soudan, notamment au Darfour, au Soudan du Sud, au Sahel, en Afghanistan, au Yémen, en Syrie et ailleurs dans le monde. Ainsi, nous regrettons la décision de la Russie de cesser la mise en œuvre de l'initiative de la mer Noire et condamnons les récentes attaques visant les ports ukrainiens qui risquent de détériorer la situation mondiale davantage. En adoptant la résolution 2417, ce Conseil s'est dit conscient de la nécessité de mettre fin au cercle vicieux du conflit armé et de l'insécurité alimentaire. Il s'est engagé à y prêter toute l'attention voulue afin de mieux prévenir la famine. Le rôle du Conseil dans la prévention des crises est également au cœur du nouvel agenda pour la paix. La Suisse appelle à la pleine mise en œuvre des mécanismes de prévention prévus dans la résolution 2417 et se félicite de la récente réunion sur la sécurité alimentaire en République démocratique du Congo, au Burkina Faso et en Haïti. Afin de mieux prévenir les crises alimentaires, y compris la famine, mon pays appelle à renforcer les 3 domaines suivants. Premièrement, le respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme par toutes les parties est impératif afin de minimiser l'impact des conflits armés sur la situation alimentaire. L'accès des civils aux biens et services essentiels doit être préservé. Les objets indispensables à la survie des civils, à l'instar des denrées alimentaires, des installations d'eau et d'autres infrastructures nécessaires à la production et à l'approvisionnement alimentaire, ne peuvent faire l'objet d'attaques. Elles doivent être protégées, comme l'exige le droit international humanitaire. Nous appelons les parties concernées à garantir l'acheminement rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux personnes dans le besoin. Nous déplorons que des acteurs humanitaires tels que le CICR ne soient pas toujours en mesure de mener à bien leurs opérations, comme en ce moment à travers le corridor de la Chine dans le Caucase du Sud. Nous rappelons également l'importance de la mise en œuvre de la résolution 2664 de ce Conseil qui facilite les opérations humanitaires dans certains contextes les plus difficiles. Deuxièmement, dans de nombreux contextes fragiles, ce sont souvent les femmes et les filles qui mangent en dernier et celles qui mangent le moins. C'est encore plus vrai dans les situations de conflit où ces dernières cherchent des solutions. Comme l'a souligné la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général chargée de la question des violences sexuelles commises en période de conflit, nous ne devons pas sous-estimer le fait que l'insécurité alimentaire augmente le risque d'exposition à la violence sexuelle. C'est pourquoi nous devons veiller à l'intégrer une perspective de genre dans les mesures visant à améliorer la sécurité alimentaire. Troisièmement, l'impunité, notamment pour ceux qui affament délibérément des civils comme méthode de guerre, doit être résolument combattue. Trop souvent, les populations civiles sont délibérément privées de leurs moyens de subsistance, ce qui provoque d'immenses souffrances et déstabilise encore davantage les zones de conflit. En 2019, le statut de la Cour pénale internationale a été modifié à l'initiative de la Suisse afin que ce crime puisse également être poursuivi dans les situations de conflit interne. Nous appelons tous les États parties à ratifier cet amendement. Monsieur le Président, La paix se bâtit mal à l'estomac vide. L'agronome américain et lauréat du prix Nobel Norman Borlaug nous le rappelle. Il est d'autant plus important de s'attaquer aux causes profondes de l'insécurité alimentaire. Les conflits armés et la violence en sont le moteur principal. La pression croissante exercée par des crises économiques et le changement climatique ajoutent aux difficultés. Les solutions politiques aux conflits doivent faire partie de notre approche globale visant à éliminer la faim, à garantir à tous l'accès à une nourriture suffisante et adéquate et à promouvoir des systèmes alimentaires résilients, inclusifs et durables. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de la Suisse. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers for their compelling presentations. As focal points for this issue at the Council, together with Switzerland, we thank the United States for providing this opportunity to advance our fight against conflict-induced food insecurity and malnutrition. We also congratulate the United States on the initiative and the Council on the adoption of the presidential statement on conflict-induced food insecurity. According to the 2023 State of Food Security and Nutrition Report, it is projected that almost 600 million people will still be facing hunger by 2030. In 2022 alone, 2.4 billion people lacked access to adequate, nutritious, safe, and sufficient food. The combination of impacts from the pandemic, climate shocks, high interest rates, high food and energy prices, and conflicts has put global food security and nutrition in dire straits, with armed conflict figuring as a prominent driver of hunger. Brazil believes that the best way to prevent hunger and malnutrition in the long term is to ensure that countries have the capacity to build resilient agri-food systems and markets. We must take into account structural causes of hunger, including inequalities between and within countries, barriers to food trade, unilateral sanctions, and weak or absent social protection and poverty alleviation policies. To ensure stability and continuity in food production, international attention must be given to supporting sustainable agricultural practices, developing disaster-resilient infrastructures, and promoting diversified agri-food systems. Ensuring the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets is essential to sustain food security in conflict situations as recognized in Resolution 2417/2018. Facilitating the transfer and access to efficient and productive technologies is central to ensuring diversified, resilient, and sustainable food systems. In line with the Secretary General Initiative on Early Warnings for All, the international community must support dedicated capacity building in developing countries to allow us to be better prepared for shocks on the availability and accessibility of food. To reach this goal, cash transfer programs should be prioritized to sustain both local supply and demand. Additionally, tools such as the IMF Food Shock Window or the Food Import Financing Facility proposed by FAO should be further explored to bridge financing needs while avoiding market distortions and disruptions to prevent global food insecurity. Many countries affected by conflicts had their agricultural development restricted by trade and price-distorting subsidies that negatively affect their production capacities. Mr. President, an important element of this open debate refers to the collaboration between the Security Council, the UN system, and other actors to catalyze global efforts, ensure delivery of humanitarian assistance, and minimize the effects of conflict-induced food insecurity. Member states must fully incorporate in their work the tools already in place in the UN system to fight conflict-induced hunger. Program and FAO diligently inform on the risks of acute food insecurity in countries with conflict situations through different reports, including the White Notes mandated by Resolution 2417/2018, to which the Council must dedicate its full attention. An efficient response to conflict-induced famine must encompass the appropriate use of this information and timely and decisive action in response to it. civilians as a method of warfare and grants special protection to objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including food crops, livestock, and other essential resources necessary for food production. However, even when parties to a conflict comply with international humanitarian law, food systems can be disrupted by the secondary impacts of conflict. Humanitarian exemptions essential to the survival of the civilian population also need to be systematically included in sanctioned regimes and counterterrorism measures. Otherwise, humanitarian actors have to overcome complex legal, financial, and logistical roadblocks to ensure that those in need get appropriate assistance. Humanitarian needs play a central role, but they can be better supported if coupled with development-oriented measures such as dedicated agricultural, technical, and subsistence support. International cooperation, generous, sustained, result-oriented international cooperation in its many forms is essential to achieve this goal. Brazil has been active in promoting such cooperation with fellow developing countries, especially each situation of conflict presents different challenges for agri-food systems and the affected populations. For instance, as recently reported by FAO, in many cases, women are still more vulnerable to food and nutrition insecurity as they continue to face additional risks, barriers, and disadvantages due to their gender. Mr. President, our response to conflict-induced food insecurity must involve the three pillars of the United Nations. Humanitarian needs must be met, and its delivery allowed in an unimpeded and impartial manner. The Council must use its political capacity to push for solutions to conflicts that can alleviate challenges related to food accessibility. We will remain fully engaged in all these fronts and continue to be a firm advocate of the right of every person to sufficient, nutritious, and adequate food. I reaffirm the highest priority given by the Brazilian government to eliminate hunger in all situations and to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. The only assured way to end conflict-induced hunger is peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je félicite les États-Unis d'Amérique pour la présidence du Conseil et pour l'initiative de cet important débat qui met en relief le lien entre l'insécurité alimentaire et les conflits armés. Je remercie la coordinatrice des Nations Unies pour la prévention et la riposte à la famine, Madame Reena Ghelani, pour sa riche contribution. J'ai suivi avec attention les interventions poignantes de Madame Naveen Salem et de Monsieur David Miliband. Madame le Président, notre débat se tient une semaine après le sommet des Nations Unies sur les systèmes alimentaires qui a interpellé la conscience universelle sur les proportions alarmantes de la famine dans le monde et martelé l'exigence ainsi que l'urgence d'y faire face. Notre réunion se tient surtout à un moment où la sécurité internationale suscite plus de questions que de réponses. En adoptant les conventions de Genève et leurs protocoles additionnels, les nations du monde ont clairement et unanimement souscrit dans leur contrat social que la guerre a des règles et que la belligérance n'est absolument pas une situation de non-droit dans laquelle toutes les cruautés et atrocités sont permises. Cet encadrement de la guerre nous connecte à notre humanité, même dans les moments les plus troubles. En aucun moment, nous ne pouvons pas, nous ne devons pas perdre de vue que la famine est une honte et une atteinte grave à la dignité humaine. Elle est encore plus insoutenable lorsqu'elle est planifiée ou entretenue, en sachant que les ressources ne manquent pas, comme l'a si bien souligné tout à l'heure Madame Ghelani. Malheureusement, dans plusieurs champs de bataille et foyers de tension dans le monde, la famine est utilisée comme arme de guerre. Au gré des calculs absurdes, l'accès à la nourriture se retrouve souvent entravé. Les pénuries qui en résultent génèrent très souvent la famine et les maladies inhérentes à la malnutrition et contribuent à détricoter le tissu social de fragments entiers de l'humanité. Les civils en particulier, les femmes et les enfants sont les plus exposés aux effets qui en découlent. Lorsqu'elle n'est pas utilisée comme arme de guerre, la famine est très souvent source de conflits et d'instabilité dans les États fragiles. En tant qu'Africains, nous sommes fondés pour 80% des personnes confrontées à l'insécurité alimentaire vivent dans des zones touchées par des conflits. Le récent rapport des Nations Unies sur la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition dans le monde met clairement en évidence l'incitation que la famine exerce sur les conflits armés, qu'elle catalyse au même titre que d'autres menaces à la paix et à la sécurité internationale, notamment les changements climatiques. Parallèlement, les conflits armés déclenchent et exacerbent les crises humanitaires, la pauvreté et la famine. Ces facteurs interagissent et se renforcent mutuellement, créant un cercle vicieux de détresse intenable. Madame la Présidente, la résolution 2417, adoptée par ce Conseil le 24 mai 2018, reconnaît l'étroitesse du lien entre les conflits armés et l'insécurité alimentaire. La persistance de la faim non seulement questionne notre humanité, mais également réduit en fiction les efforts de la communauté internationale pour mettre fin aux conflits armés. Dans plusieurs régions du monde, notamment au Sahel, dans la région des Grands Lacs et dans la Corne de l'Afrique, les groupes armés et groupes terroristes détruisent délibérément les magasins d'alimentation, brûlent les champs, empêchent les paysans de cultiver, détruisent les infrastructures de production, les systèmes de transport et de distribution des denrées alimentaires. Dans ces régions où l'instabilité devient chronique, les enfants squelettiques meurent de faim à la merci des oiseaux de proie. Cette situation est moralement insoutenable. Nous devons y répondre en tant que Conseil de sécurité, sur qui les peuples du monde ont placé le destin de leur sécurité et de leur dignité. Notre réponse doit aller au-delà des déclarations cosmétiques et s'inscrire à la dimension du défi. Notre dynamique de mobilisation doit être globale pour faire face aux effets des conflits armés sur la sécurité alimentaire dans le monde et, en définitive, prévenir l'émergence de nouveaux foyers de famine. En premier lieu, nous devons être plus engagés pour financer l'adaptation au changement climatique et investir davantage dans l'agriculture durable et la sécurité alimentaire à long terme. Cela implique de soutenir les petits agriculteurs, d'améliorer les infrastructures agricoles et de promouvoir des pratiques agricoles respectueuses de l'environnement. L'appel à l'action du secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Antonio Guterres, pour accélérer la transformation des systèmes alimentaires mérite d'être salué et de trouver une réponse favorable auprès de tous. En second lieu, nous devons renforcer les mécanismes de réponse d'urgence pour faire face aux crises alimentaires aiguës.